Well, it's a very pleasure to be here. I know Rene from a long time ago, probably the same time that Annalise met Rene in River Alta, in the north part of Bolivia, when I was working for an NGO on projects with Brazil nut collectors, and I was doing my thesis at that time on the extractive economies, and Rene came with ProMap, bringing students, and was a quite interesting experience, meeting all this group of people working in the north of Bolivia. So thanks for the invitation. I think also appreciate the two previous talks that really provide a nice setup for the things that I'm going to say. And what I want to share with you are some insights from my work, well, with smallholders in different realities in the tropics, from the places that I know more. I have been working in the Amazon, in the eastern part of the Amazon, in the western part of the Amazon. Then I moved to Asia, and I did a bit of work in Indonesia as well. So I'm trying to bring some insights from that, my work, from the work of colleagues also that have been working in these places, and from the conversations that I had with smallholders in these places. So I hope that that's useful for this discussion. And somehow, with colleagues that I'm working now in WWF, we tend to frame our discussions in the context of the triple challenge that we are facing as a society, and objectives that we have to meet. At the same time, which is becoming more difficult, as we know. One is related to climate and keeping the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees, and also we acknowledge that that is probably a goal that we are not going to be able to meet. The second is halt and reverse biodiversity loss. We all know that we are losing biodiversity, and it's very hard to reverse those trends, also as Mark was talking about. And then is the topic about food security and bringing nutritious food for all, but also acknowledging that the population will keep growing, 1 more billion to 2030. And also we should take into account that probably more than a half of that growth is going to be in Africa. So those are still quite significant challenges that still frame should frame our discussion on smallholders, which are part of the big major topics that Mark has been looking at in these scenarios. And also we know that smallholders, they make a significant contribution to food supply. Some studies they are saying it's probably the third of total food supply, and others are saying it's more than a half. And they depend on land, forests, and the goods and services these lands and forests they provide for them. But at the same time, they also have a significant role in shaping the land use and ecosystem services in all these places. But who do we call smallholders? And probably those are the things that come to our mind when we start thinking about smallholders. Also, they are rural households that hold a small area of land. They heavily rely on their own farm or family labor, but eventually they may hire labor as well. They depend on farming for food and for obtaining some cash income, because also they have to pay for some other needs and sending the kids to the school, or health assistance if they need. And also they embrace different type of economies. And different mixes, from subsistence economies to commercial agriculture, and in reality is a combination of subsistence and commercial agriculture. And then we know that they have a relatively diversified livelihood portfolios, that those can be farm and on-farm, and they, as Annalise was suggesting as well, they also work outside of their own farms if they want to meet their income needs. But also they are constrained. They have all these constraints to land, to capital, to markets, to labor, to finance, etc. And something that's important to take into account is that much of how do they organize and these interactions that they establish are mediated by these cultural norms. And I think they differ from place to place. And are norms that they are either is a legacy that they may have, but also they build and rebuild these cultural norms. So what are the realities? And I think the realities of smallholders in the tropics a little bit challenge also these definitions of the ideas that we have with smallholders. And probably something that is part of this discussion and is becoming much more dominant now is that a bit the entry point of smallholders doesn't allow us to see the social or ethnic identities of these people that live in the forest. Because we tend to call smallholders to everyone, but I don't think that's necessarily permissible. Perspectives in places where you have ethnic, indigenous populations in places that academics, as Annalise was referring to, also they have been called smallholders. And I think over time, we have started to understand these multiple realities and also ethnic realities and different realities of identities, social identities that we have in these forest landscapes. But anyway, going back to the definition of smallholders, I think we recognize that the size of the land that smallholders they may have in the tropics, they vary a lot. We can find places in which smallholders may have 2 hectares, like in Indonesia, or in Brazil, a typical smallholders in the Amazon is a farmer who holds 100 hectares. And why 100? Because at that time in the 70s, as Annalise was referring, the government decided to allocate land to people coming from the northeast to the Amazon in 100 hectare plots. And they divided places and they got 100 hectares. But then a few years after, the smallholders, they just got 50, 100 hectares because land was becoming a bit more scarce. But I think that's to give a sense about how multiple are the realities of smallholders, even when we take this perspective of the size of the land. But another thing that I think is important, that we should not just look at the size of the land, because that doesn't necessarily explain what are the factors that explain why some farmers are better off than others. And that's related to diversity of other factors that explain social differentiation, which has to do with, for example, how close or remote they are from the markets, availability of labor, capital, knowledge, etc. So I think we have to take into account these multiple factors, and also the fact that many smallholders, they depend from activities outside of the farms. So they are doing work in the cities, or they are sending, or part of the family is working on the cities, urban centers. They can migrate, and probably the people that is living in those places depend from incomes from people working outside of the farms. So these smallholders, they have quite diversified strategies that they go beyond their own farms. And as I was referring, they tend to have very diverse and mixed social and ethnic identities. And for example, when I'm thinking about this perspective of identities, it comes to my mind interesting cases, for example, from rubber tappers and rubber tappers in the Amazon, that basically were people coming from a different region to the Amazon, and they built an identity as rubber tappers. And these identities have been changing over time as well. They became rubber tappers, then they started to become farmers or ranchers. So I think it's a more fluid perspective that also we have to take into the identities of smallholders. But also there are similarities. And yeah, we acknowledge that there's lots of diversity of smallholders in the tropics, but also there are important similarities, I think, from place to place. And I think the ones that came to my mind when thinking about this is that this, I would say, one important similarity is that they are this influence of these collectively built cultural norms, whatever those are. I think smallholders, they tend to interact and build norms and institutions that are going to regulate the way in which they coexist together in these places. So you can think of Indonesia, you can think in Brazil, you can think in Bolivia. But also they get organized. Wherever you go, I think there's an important capacity for smallholders to get organized, to get access to market inputs or to get services. And also the fact that smallholders, they tend to depend in very extended family networks as safety nets. And I think that's very much the case in the tropics. Even when you have these very fluid interactions between rural areas and urban areas, people that's living in the cities, they tend to send cash back to their families in the rural areas. And also I think they tend to adapt to, they have a very high capacity to adapt to shifting institutional and market context in the face of all these pressures that Annalise was mentioning. And then they are, well, all of them, this is obvious, they are exposed to these risks and they have some difficulties to deal with these risks. But at the same time, I think it's important, and Annalise has introduced this, there are many important rural transformations that are shaping the realities of smallholders in the tropics. And probably the most important for me is the market penetration. And probably that has been since the late 80s, 90s that we have observed this so important penetration of markets that's associated with the development of infrastructure, at the same time globalization and more connected supply chains that really have produced a pressure in these forest landscapes, or places that we used to think that they were forest landscapes. So a lot of infrastructure, markets, roads, as Annalise was mentioned, urban centers, and more competition for land. And also, this has led to important social differentiation. And there has been also this mention that we have started to understand that there are important processes of segmentation, differentiation going on in these places. So let me mention three typical situations also that I have in my mind when I look at these landscapes. And first of all, it comes to me all these forest-based economies. Then we have a more type of traditional and typical family farming as well that depend on more mixed combination of activities. And then the commercial smallholder farming that has been growing along with this market penetration that I was referring to. And I wanted to talk rapidly about these three typical situations. And this is the forest-based economies in the Western Amazon, which is the place where I met Renee, which basically is a region that's living from Brazil nuts collection. But in the past, they were rubber tappers. And in the past, there was this, probably they were indigenous people coming from the north, becoming rubber tappers, then becoming Brazil nut collectors. They got allocated land. Everybody was calling them independent smallholders because they were no longer working on the rubber estates. But the thing is that they were able to consolidate an economy that's based on forests, resources, on Brazil nuts. This is a typical Brazil nut collector that they complement incomes with agriculture. They have small plots of land. And their lands have been titled collectively because it was easier to title these lands collectively. So they became communities. And this is an economy that is strongly connected to the export market. So they depend on Brazil nuts, make a good income of that. And that has been made possible that the forests are still well preserved. But that probably is a unique situation. But you may find this type of more extractive economies also in some other places of the tropics. Then we have this traditional family farming. But I think all these traditional family farming cases are going into an important process of transition. And that's what we can see, for example, in the Eastern Amazon. That are basically families of colonists that are making an income from agriculture. They practice slash and burn agriculture. They introduce perennials into their economies, cocoa, black pepper, but also they started to rely on cattle. So they have these very combinations of very mixed economies that at the same time has produced a very mixed landscape as well. And also they have home gardens. And they complement their food from food that's coming from home gardens. The women spend time on these gardens. So it's a quite diverse economy, but it's an economy in transition as well. And many of these people are sending their kids to the schools in the towns or in the cities because they don't want their kids to suffer the same constraints or privations that they had to suffer. So these places are going to be in transition. And then we have these more typical commercials for smallholder oil palm growers, for example, in Indonesia. And that's also an expression of all these pressures that we were talking about. So important market penetration, more connections to global markets, more pressures of lands. And as a result, we have also smallholders that they have got integrated into the supply chains. And there are many different types of smallholders, which is the same thing. Smallholders connected to plantation economies and the smallholders that are not connected to the plantation economies, we tend to call them independent smallholders. Even they may have multiple type of social or ethnic identities. And they struggle. And probably the most important bottom line that has been identified on this type of commercial economies connected to smallholders is about yields. They are not able to obtain the same yields that their typical commercial farm would obtain, and in this case, plantation. So there is all this discussion about how to make possible to upgrade the production systems of the smallholders so that they can obtain the same yields as plantation economies. So this is to give you a flavor about the different type of economies or situations that we can find on smallholders in the tropics. And going back to this discussion about the triple challenges, yeah, I think smallholders, they have an important role to play in meeting these triple challenges, but there are going to be important trade-offs. So it will be impossible to meet the three challenges at the same time with no trade-offs. May not be economically cost-effective in all cases, so probably companies, they will don't, or investors or these funds that are being created, they will not be able to find financially viable cases in working with smallholders in many cases. But probably the outcomes, the social outcomes are going to be better if you work with smallholders. And we have to acknowledge that there are going to be impacts from climate change in all of these cases. And the fact that nature is stewardship of smallholders is underappreciated. So what should we keep aiming for? I think an important thing that comes to my mind is that still all the work that we should aim with working more with these forest-based economies is about empowerment. This has been places that struggle, so I think it's quite important to build and work with local organizations on empowering them or helping them to self-strengthen and self-empower. And these are probably places in which there's a lot of, as I was saying, indigenous peoples or indigenous groups that they control resources that are being called as smallholders. So and now there's important perspectives about how to build with them economies that are sustainable in the long run, but also that they self-empower their own organizations. And on traditional farming and mosaic landscapes, I think smallholders should be able to sustain their economies and achieve their social needs as they see what their social needs are. And smallholders in commodity landscapes, I think the whole challenge is how to improve the uptake of practices so they can increase land productivity and be able to benefit or capture a little bit more of the benefits of these supply chains. But as it was mentioned before, I think it's important to think that there's need of wider transformations in the food systems, aiming at increasing resilience of smallholders, reducing gender inequalities, shifting diets, and reducing food loss and waste. So I think it's impossible not to think that whatever solution we can bring to smallholders or they may build by themselves is not going to be disconnected with wider transformations that we need in the food and economic systems. Is this doable? That's still the question. But I think several groups are insisting with the need to keep improving the tenure rights of these smallholders, also work more on compensations for nature stewardship, long-term contracts with off-takers, premiums of good practices, tailor financial options, more inclusive business options. So I think the many of things that still need to be done and built with smallholders and farmers are there. But we know that there are no quick fixes. There's need of more long-term partnerships and landscape climate type of responses. So it's not going to be easy, but I think we have to keep insisting on these different types of actions that can be built with and for smallholders in the tropics. And this is a bit also the ideas that came to me of how Tropenbos can contribute to this process, and you will tell me, yeah, but those are things that Tropenbos is already doing, which is support smallholders as landscape stewards, build funds, tailor funds to these farmers in these landscapes, leverage on these opportunities on climate finance. There's much more philanthropic money now going to forest landscapes to support the smallholders and indigenous people that we may be calling smallholders as well. There's more partnerships coming into place, trying to mainstream sustainability and social inclusion. The corporate sector is playing an important role in that process. And also, I think there are lots of knowledge that already Tropenbos may have that's really important to connect all that knowledge on these specific landscapes with these global processes that are taking place. And that a bit resonates with what Annalise is saying about in terms of helping to build these more bottom-up approaches. For example, now there's a lot of talking and ambitions around nature-based solutions, for example. But those come as very top-down processes, very abstract concepts that I think all the knowledge that institutions as Tropenbos they have should be able to bring a bit of a reality check and be able to synthesize the knowledge that you have to inform those processes. And it would be really nice to see that organizations that are working more on the ground, they are able to connect with all of these global processes or initiatives or philanthropic money or corporate money that's coming from the top, looking for solutions to achieve these big global targets that we have. So I would say, probably for me, that's the way to go for Tropenbos in the future. So thank you very much.